いやー、すいませんね、横に乗っけてもらってありがとうございます。これすごいですね、この車。
千葉君だからしょうがない。
いや、千葉君じゃないですよ。
In the world of the car enthusiast, there's a handful of locations that hold a certain level of reverence. The most obvious examples would be some of the world's most iconic tracks like Spa, Daytona, Le Mans, and the Nürburgring, each carrying its own unique history of incredible machines and drivers being pushed to the absolute limit year after year. Some spots may not be as well kept, but still have an important place in automotive history. Take the Rally Monte Carlo, the Stelvio Pass in Italy, or the Bonneville Salt Flats of Utah, where the machines we spend so much time working on and perfecting get tested in the rawest way possible. Maybe it's just a cool set piece used in some form of automotive media, like the bridge featured in the intro race from Too Fast, Too Furious, or the Dunsfield Aerodrome turned test track that all the classic Top Gear fans should recognize. Each of these locations and more hold a special place in the hearts and minds of many a petrolhead across the world. But if you were looking for a place that combines the automotive excellence, raw driving technique, and iconic media status of all these locations, in my opinion, two of your best candidates are going to be found a bit further east. Dotted across Japan are two types of driving roads pivotal to this deep dive. The first are the fast, flowing, and usually very crowded major city expressways, with examples like Osaka, Nagoya, and especially the C1 Loop in Tokyo standing out as hotbeds for tuners and young street racers coming up since the 80s. And the second are the toge, or mountain passes, which are tight, winding, and difficult roads found in many different prefectures throughout Japan, although most of the well-known ones are clustered along the Japanese Alps, or Nihon-Alps, just west and north of Tokyo. These roads are known for being the birthplace of drifting dating back to when Keiichi Tsuchiya first started honing his skills on these passes in the early to mid-70s. And since then, all manner of drivers have tried, and often failed, to tame these harsh public roads. Although if you're anything like me, you're unfortunately probably never going to get anywhere near these types of roads anytime soon. But if you still want a taste for what it's like to race on these iconic roads and a bit more, then I might have the perfect racing game series for you: Tokyo Xtreme Racer. If you've been watching my content for a while, you might realize that this isn't actually my first time reviewing these games. And that's because my first ever game-focused video essay was me attempting to review Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift 2, one of the later entries in the series. I say attempt because it was, not very good. This would be a good starting point for getting a feel for the franchise.
I won't lie. This is definitely me when I'm...
The audio was bad, I left a scanline filter on the emulator which obliterated the footage, and worst of all, this video had next to no script, which you can tell by how lopsided the actual structure of the video was. That also happened because a lot of my early reviews were really just me reviewing the games I was most passionate about from the franchises I wanted to cover, and skimming over the rest. I stopped doing that with the Gran Turismo video, which thankfully means I'm giving these franchises the full look-throughs they deserve, but it can also lead to some, let's say, extended cuts. But also, I think because of how bad my first video from 2.5 years ago was, it's about time I return to the topic, as the series itself is returning to the major racing game space with its new release. And before we get to that, we have to go way, way back. Now first up on our journey, we have Shutokō Battle 94 Keiichi Tsuchiya Drift King. Now you might notice something about this game. I should hope you would. None of these words say Tokyo Xtreme Racer, and more importantly, none of them are in English. That's because I did a little lie at the start of the video, and that was that there's technically no Tokyo Xtreme Racer series in Japan. See, in North America, there's only 8 games that carry the Tokyo Xtreme Racer name, and if I wanted to be cheeky, I could claim there are only 2 games in the series, because in PAL regions, that's actually correct. There's just Tokyo Xtreme Racer and Tokyo Xtreme Racer. Yeah, names are going to be real confusing if you're not already familiar with this franchise. But to summarize, there are technically 33 games that fall under the broad Shutokō Battle umbrella, and if we cut out the mobile games, the bike racer, and their spin-off attempt at a Gran Turismo clone, and a few of the games that are extremely similar and simple, meaning there'd be a lot of overlap. Sorry to all my Shutokō Battle 97, Drift King, Keiichi Tsuchiya, and Masaki Bendo New Limited Version 97 enjoyers. We now have a list of games covered in the video, including gems like Shutokō Battle 99, Shutokō Battle 05, Shutokō Battle 25, Shutokō Battle 0, which came out in 2001, Shutokō Battle 01, which came out in 2003, and Shutokō Battle 10, which came out in 2006. Yeah, so I'm gonna stick with the naming order of North America, then Europe, then Japan. So I'm gonna call these their English names first if they got a release outside of Japan. Got it? No, well, too bad, because the first one never got an English release, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, Shutokō Battle 94 Keiichi Tsuchiya Drift King, which I will just be calling SB94 for the sake of brevity, was the first release for the series all the way back on the Super Famicom. Remember, this is Japan only. And to be fair, this is a really good first attempt at a racing game. Wait, it was actually their third attempt because they had already made Aguri Suzuki F1 Super Driving in GP1. Please tell me these games get better with their names. The driving feels surprisingly refined for a Super Nintendo game. It's obviously not going to touch modern games, and the sim snobs wouldn't pay it any attention, but as a simple mid-90s racing game, it's more than serviceable, and pairs well with the detailed track design. This game follows a design for its difficulty that shows up in a lot of early 2.5 and 3D racing games that doesn't really have a name, but I call it the Midnight Club method of adding challenge. Basically, in a lot of 3D racers, the ability to program truly fair and hard CPU players to race against wasn't really there. So instead, the physics and tracks were often designed in a way that makes them the primary factor in a game's difficulty. While Midnight Club 2 and 3 are the best examples of this, other good examples are games like Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed, Racing Lagoon, Ridge Racer, and this. While it can cause some initial frustration getting used to the handling and track combo, the learning curve is usually gradual enough so that it never feels overwhelming. Although there are exceptions that I'll get to. And learning to master the tightly designed physics is one of the most satisfying parts of these games, which I personally think is one part missing from a lot of modern racers. But in SB94, it's very well done. The atmosphere of this game is also solid, if a bit bare bones. There's less than a dozen songs on the soundtrack split between the menus of text that I can definitely read, and some cutscenes featuring a cast of characters including the Drift King himself, Keiichi Tsuchiya. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention him. Despite his name being on the box and featuring in many of the cutscenes, you could almost entirely remove him and it really wouldn't change the game. There's not like a Drift King training section to show you how to drift, which is probably a good thing because the drifting feels awful in this game. And unless I miss something in the text I can't read, it's not like you're going to be facing off with him at the end of a very simplistic progression, although that would be cool. The car and track list in this game is definitely a bit limited compared to its AAA contemporaries like the original Mario Kart and F-Zero, although there is one thing you might not have noticed about this game. Unlike a lot of modern racing games, licensed cars weren't nearly as common in the early 90s, and oftentimes only appeared in games specifically made to showcase certain cars, like Jaguar XG220 or the various games developed for Lotus. There were exceptions to this, like the cars featured in the Outrun and Test Drive games, but overall they weren't nearly as common as they are today. Now Genki, trying to make a game based on the real street racing of the tracks and expressways, wanted to use real-life cars, but, and this is just speculation on my part, didn't have the capital at the time to justify licensing the real cars. So what did they do? They realized the SNES puts out no resolution, so basically just made lookalikes and slapped different names on them. Nobody noticed. So this game features a definitely not Nissan Silvia S13, Nissan Skyline GTR R32, Toyota Supra JZA80, and a Mazda RX-7 FD3S, all given names that vaguely allude to what they're actually supposed to be. This is a neat little fact to point out now, but in my opinion it gets really funny later and you'll see why. The tracks are also unique, showcasing a few different environments that we'd see in a lot of the later games, and even having the first appearance of Gymkhana in the series, which I really didn't expect to see this early on. It's one of my favorite additions in the later games, so I'm glad to see it all the way back here. To be completely fair in my assessment of this game, I can't really say how this stacked up at the time compared to its competition, both because I wasn't there and no one in the native English side of the world got to experience this game. But damn, this is a pretty solid way to start off the series, because this still feels good to play now, and like any good game, it got a sequel, Shutokō Battle 2 Drift King Keiichi Tsuchiya and Masaki Bando. In a lot of ways, this just feels like an expansion and slight refinement on the original's formula. There's more tracks, a properly detailed performance stat screen. Oh, also, for those of you wondering what PS means, because it is going to come up a lot in this video, PS, or this, is a German term meaning horsepower, which you'd think would just make it the same as horsepower, but 1 PS is exactly this much horsepower, which seems like an arbitrary amount to change, but in effect, it's another way of measuring a car's power output in units that are ever so slightly smaller than a horsepower. You can roughly think of them as the same thing because of how small the difference is, but a good example of why it's important, have you ever wondered why a lot of JDM cars in racing games are labeled as having 276 horsepower? Some of you likely know that it stems from the 1989 Gentleman's Agreement between the major Japanese manufacturers to limit the power of their sports cars to curb the rise in driver fatalities. As you can guess, it was broken almost immediately, but since no one said anything, all the official documentation still shows cars like the Toyota Supra, RX-7, and Lancer Evo as only making 276 horsepower. But why such an odd number like 276? That's because they weren't measuring the cars in horsepower, they were measuring them in PS, which gives you a much cleaner 280, the actual number the cars were limited to. There's your JDM car fact of the day. Now back to SB2. The car list is almost identical to the first, with the S13 being swapped out for the new S14 and RX-7 being swapped out for the MR2 SW20, the Type K being swapped out with the Type K and the Type X being swapped out for the Type M, which is a way less cool name. SB2 and 94 remind me a bit of my thoughts on the PC versions of Need for Speed Hot Pursuit and High Stakes. Yeah, the latter of the two is almost objectively the better and more polished experience, but there's nothing wrong with going back to the original. Especially since they're all abandonware, so the cost is however much of a headache you get trying to set up an emulator for the first time. But I think it's worth it to give these a try. Just please let the next game be in English. Tokyo Highway Battle. Not quite Tokyo Xtreme Racer yet, but we'll get there. This is a... Wait, what do you mean? There's a Sega Saturn game? Okay. So apparently Genki also made a Ridge Racer clone for the Sega Saturn, which got two separate versions. The bad one, which was released everywhere under the name Highway 2000, and the less bad one, which was Japan exclusive and called Wangan Dead Heat plus Real Arrange. Take a guess which one I'm playing in the footage. But they're seen more as spin-offs in the Shutokō Battle series, and I'm only covering one of those. And these did not make the cut, so I'm leaving them with this mention. Anyway, Tokyo Highway Battle, their first game on the PS1, and it looks awfully familiar to another game I know on the PS1. Yeah, they really weren't shaking off the Ridge Racer influence they got with Highway 2000, especially not in the menus and overall presentation. And to be honest, the OG does it better there, but in the actual gameplay, I don't really know what to compare it to. The handling feels very unique for a PS1 game, giving you that weight and inertia almost like what we'd go on to see in stuff like Gran Turismo, but this is different, because a lot of that weight doesn't come from the physics, but actually from the dynamic and slightly exaggerated camera movements. The camera dips and dives as you go over crests and drops, it tilts significantly as you turn, and overall gives it a really analog feeling to these purely digital cars that I really appreciate. While this feature wasn't introduced in THB, I could finally use the upgrade shop that had been in since the original Shutokō Battle, because now the labels and descriptions are in English. I do like how detailed the upgrade options are, especially compared to something like Gran Turismo, which wasn't even out when this debuted. But I wish it could have told me more about how these upgrades actually impacted the car either statistically or by affecting the little performance graphs a la Need for Speed. Because to be honest, I don't really feel much of a difference using the upgrades, except for one. This, labeled Omit Fuel Cut. What it does is remove the fuel cutoff sensor, allowing for a higher top speed, because without doing this, every car in the game is limited to 180 kilometers an hour. This is actually a real thing many JDM cars had on their ECUs, with the same basic idea that caused the 280 PS rule. This is actually a really neat touch of realism to the game that I can appreciate. What I don't appreciate is how outside of the one line of text under the upgrade itself, nothing in the game or the manual suggests that you can do this. So if you're working off the logic of every other racing game ever made, you'll dump a bunch of money into your engine parts just to not go any faster, when in reality you should have been upgrading the electronics because that's where the real gains come in. And that's kinda just a reflection on my general feelings for this game. It's interesting and has some unique ideas, but nothing stands out enough to make me really want to play it. Like, the physics and track designs are fun and decently challenging, but Ridge Racer 1 does them so much better. And the difference with Ridge Racer was that when I played that game, I got a feeling of, this is fun and hard, and I'm learning how it works quickly enough to overcome that challenge and have even more fun. While here, it's a feeling of, this is kinda fun and hard, but by the time I learn how to master the handling, I won't be having fun anymore. Or what I call the modern Need for Speed handling problem. Or take the style of the game. Yes, it's racist ridging once again, but there is still some unique choices in the environments and music not taken from Sony's then #1 racing son. And while I know a lot of people who grew up with the soundtrack really like it, I found it just a little underwhelming. Partially because I'm just not the biggest on this brand of 90s arcade racer J-rock, but also because other games from in and around the same time did it better. Like, listen to these. Now, it might just be me, but I much prefer that to this. This is really a low point in my enjoyment of this series, not because it's bad, more just because it's uninteresting. Although that means there's nowhere to go but up from here, and this time under a more familiar name. Finally, we're at the actual series you probably knew about, Tokyo Xtreme Racer, which actually looked like this in 1999, guess they didn't feel like capitalizing the R yet. Even though the series started with the SNES, this is where the actual gameplay and structure from the later games comes from, and that requires a bit of explanation. So you know how in modern arcade racing games, the vast majority of the ones people talk about are open world racers, where the map and environment are completely open to be explored by the player. This was popularized by series like Midnight Club and Need for Speed in the mid-2000s, even though it technically goes back a bit further. To a certain extent, you could class TXR as an open-world street racer, but that wouldn't be entirely accurate, as what you have available to you is just a specific section of the greater Shutokō Expressway, called Route C1 or the C1 Loop, which covers a portion of central Tokyo. This is all you're limited to in the first game, although later entries would expand into other parts of the expressway. When you leave the garage to go out onto the road, you'll see a number of other racers already driving around. You'll then need to flash your lights at them to engage in a race. Seems pretty conventional so far, especially compared to modern open world racers. But then, you enter an SP battle, or Spirit Point battle, and you learn why this game is really different. Now basically every reviewer who describes the SP battle system compares it to fighting games. And who am I to break with tradition? So the SP bars basically serve as you and your opponent's health, like in a fighting game. But instead of attacking your opponent to drain their health and win, you instead need to put distance between you and your rival in order to drain their SP. In later games, your SP would also drain if you made contact with your opponent, the traffic cars, or even just the guardrails and walls along the side of the road. And the first one to completely drain their opponent's SP bar is the winner. In my opinion, this is similar to the point-to-point system from Burnout Paradise, but it actually fixes a lot of my problems with it a decade earlier. Not always having a fixed point the player needs to race to, and also by making each route you take feel different every time you drive through it. Now that might not make a lot of sense at face value. How would going around the same loop feel different every time you do it? To me, it comes from three main factors. There's actually more, but they come in later games, so there's only three main ones that apply to the first game. The traffic, the physics, and the upgrades. When driving around the map, any skilled player would start to make a mental map of the track and what's up ahead in order to properly judge the accelerating, braking, and turning points needed to take the fastest path through the loop. This is standard fare in racing games, and is why a lot of racing lines look very similar, both in games and in real life. But something that games often miss out on is that if there's always one static, unchanging line that would always be the best to take through every corner, that would get pretty boring if you learn to master it. Now in real life, there's so many minute variables and tiny inconsistencies lap to lap that mean the racing line is never in the exact same spot, or rather isn't always approached in the exact same way. This is even more so when you're racing against an opponent, because all of their actions dictate what your best course of action is in that situation, whether that's to brake earlier or later, or to try and draft them and take at the inside line. All those factors change what the race feels like, and to a lot of people, that's what makes racing fun. Is that sort of back and forth between two skilled drivers reacting to each other's decision making in real time. That's why some people call racing a high-speed game of chess, because it requires a similar level of reactions and planning to counter your opponent's movements while not compromising your own integrity. Now what does that have to do with the traffic in TXR? Well, when you go into a corner, you're likely going to start preparing the car so that it can take your mentally optimal line. But if there's a van in the path of your line, you then have to start figuring out how to adjust and compromise your line so that you don't lose as much time as you would just slamming straight into it. Because this is still a busy expressway, traffic is practically everywhere. Not as much as it would be in real life, remember, this is still a game, but enough to give the player a dynamic feeling when driving on any part of the road, always keeping you on your toes. This is another part of why games like Midnight Club feel so fun and challenging, because they combine that track difficulty focused design with the ever-changing traffic to make sure the player never gets too comfortable, even if they think they've figured out the map. This sort of design is aided even further by the physics, which in my early hours I found a little annoying to get a hold of. It just feels kinda floaty and a little slow, and the collisions are insanely goofy looking because you're just bouncing off everything like a rubber ball. But I eventually came to realize how well these physics work with the map as I progressed and got faster cars, because it basically made the driving feel like one fluid motion, but without feeling unresponsive or stiff. And if for whatever reason you think it feels stiff and unresponsive, you can literally change that in the settings of this and every TXR that would follow. So if you're a new player to racing games who think modern arcade racers are too twitchy, or Max Verstappen who wouldn't drive a car unless its turning circle is 7mm, you can adjust the cars to your driving. And if you need even more adjustments to the car, you can always unlock them using the upgrades. Upgrading your car means so much in these games. Now that might seem obvious, but I mean that in a different way than I normally would, as these games not only tie the upgrades to the progression by pricing them to only be afforded at certain points in the campaign, and in later games locking them behind bosses and milestones, but also in dramatically changing the driving. Let me make a comparison. Forza Horizon 5. In my opinion, Forza does a terrible job at demonstrating to you what each individual upgrade does to the car. Yeah, engine parts make the car go faster, lighter parts make it accelerate quicker, and tires make it grip better, but they barely show what effects those parts really have. The only time I really care about what a part is doing when I'm upgrading my cars in Forza is when it's lowering my PI rating, giving me a new slider to mess with, or increasing the specific stat I need. I rarely care about how it actually factors into the car. By contrast, TXR makes nearly every part impact the car in a believable way. I went into it assuming transmission parts that added weight would only make my car slower, but doing so also gave me a lower ratio differential, which made my acceleration noticeably better than it was before. And with an extra gear I got, which came with the added weight, I didn't lose any top speed. Yeah, that same example could just as easily apply to Forza, and it has been before when I've been tuning cars. The difference is, I had to do tuning and testing to reconfigure those gears to get that full benefit, and I didn't notice it being any quicker until I got back out on track and compared the times. Here, I noticed it from the moment I got it on the track because of how different it feels to use and how well the game portrays its sense of speed. That's another area these games do well, sense of speed. They might not have all the camera effects, speed lines, and motion blur you'd expect from games with great sense of speed, at least not yet, but that's because they use one of the most basic techniques for making a game feel fast, which is having any kind of physical marker you could use to judge your location zoom past you in an instant, meaning you are literally speeding by it. It's a basic thing that all racing games technically do, but when you have this many close visual indicators as you would in a tight tunnel or twisting highway section, you notice it a lot more. And these aren't the only cool new additions to the game either, just the ones I think are the most noticeable. You also have in-depth visual customization, letting you make cars that look a lot more like the custom shop creations spreading through Japan at the time. You get a larger car list featuring a lot of the lesser-known JDM sports cars, and also not even trying to hide the fact that they're based on certain real models by literally naming the cars after their real-life model codes. I have no idea how they got away with this and would continue to for a few years, but either way I find this very funny. And they also introduced rivals with their own teams and little backstories to give the game the slightest amount of world building. While it can almost entirely be ignored here in the first game, it is a neat addition to see that adds some flair to racing Nameless AI number 437, and many of these teams and bosses would go on to be staples of the franchise, appearing in nearly every game, and making them all somewhat connected. Meaning that in the few games that try to expand on the flavor text into an actual story, they can do so while drawing on the games that didn't, which I think is pretty neat. All in all, I think I really enjoyed the original Tokyo Xtreme Racer more than I ever thought I really would. Now, does that mean it's perfect? Obviously not. There's still a lot of polish issues and little things that I think could be expanded on, like the game's length, relatively small map, and the lack of any other kinds of racing outside of the 1v1 battles. But I think those will definitely get addressed in the future. I feel like I'm going to make some people mad in this section, but before I do that, let me make one massive correction from the last video I did on TXR. No, Tokyo Xtreme Racer 0 is not a port of Tokyo Xtreme Racer 2. They share the same cover, they share a good few songs in their soundtracks. Unless I'm seeing things wrong, there's at least a few car models shared between the games, and they obviously share some of the race mechanics and rivals. Obviously, TXR 0 is not a port of TXR 2. TXR 0 is the better TXR 2. Yeah, if you're one of the people that came into the series with 2, you'd probably have a different perspective on this, but as someone who came in with 0, this is literally the only game with a TXR name that I actively disliked playing. And that's not from lack of trying, because I got a good few hours into the game, although you wouldn't be able to tell because the progression is so fucking slow. I will admit that this series is kind of known for being a bit on the grindier side, and for being a completionist's nightmare, and you want to guess where that all started? Right here. It starts out innocent enough when you're just buying a car, giving it an upgrade or two, and then going out onto the newly expanded expressway, and then you go and do a few races, where you receive a pittance for your work. And because of the new physics that feel even floatier than before, and the walls that are coated in superglue, actually winning races is a lot more difficult now, but not in an enjoyable way. Due to that terrible physics and track combo, you can basically only rely on your car's power to win races in the early game, which again, is going to be limited because you're broke as fuck. And also, if you didn't pick a good starter car, you might as well just be screwed from the get-go. This game also introduced Wanderers, which are racers not associated with any team, that also aren't boss racers, and will often have special conditions that you need to meet before you can race them. Now, I don't have a problem with these in concept. I really like the idea and how it's executed in later games, but what I do have a problem with is these games often being so poorly translated that the in-game descriptions meant to help you race them are often obtuse or just plain incorrect. Like, just because you got them to show up doesn't mean they'll actually race you. And if they're one of those only shows up on every third day in June type Wanderers, you think I'm joking, but there's Wanderers in this series with requirements like that, then good luck if they show up and you're not driving this specific 1982 Savannah RX-7 FB with 69,000 kilometers on the dash and the BBS LMs they wanted, because they will not race you if you're not to their liking. Are you starting to see why I didn't have that much fun playing this game? And to be fair to it, it's still got a lot of the unique and interesting characteristics of a TXR game, but that's also kinda it. It's just another TXR game in a series that has so many better entries. Entries like... Okay, this is where things really start to get good. Tokyo Xtreme Racer 0, by technicality, was my first experience with the Tokyo Xtreme Racer name. I say by technicality because I played both this and Drift 2 at the same time, and when we're talking about me at age 3, my memories aren't exactly the clearest. When that's the case, I usually just go with whatever came out first chronologically, which is why I say Need for Speed Underground 1 was my first Need for Speed, or really my first racing game period, despite having all of these around the same time. Regardless, TXR 0, as mentioned in the last section, is basically what happens when you take the straightforward quality and focus of the first game, combine it with the new ideas and additions added in the second, and let it bake for an extra year in the brand new PS2. This leaves you with a fresh new entry from the time that I'd call the first great Tokyo Xtreme Racer. Now, is it perfect? Oh, calling this game perfect would be a brutal disservice to all the 7 out of 10s this game really sits with. Then again, the 7 out of 10 range is where a lot of the most experimental greats come from, the love it or hate it kind of games that still retain a decent following, And that's what TXR0 really is. If you click with what Zero has to offer, there are few games that are as enjoyable as this. To begin, let's go with the weakest link in the last game's chain, the progression. Progression-wise, this is one of the smoothest games to go through in the series, and it does the thing that, in my opinion, makes all great racing game progressions, which is following the formula: make slow cars fun, make faster slow cars feel unique, make getting faster fun, and make the fastest cars controllable and attainable. Now, most of those steps actually don't have to do with the progression per se, but more with how the physics, campaign structure, customization, and car list intertwine. Some racing games might get one or multiple of these things right, but a truly great single-player racing game gets all of them right. While Zero isn't a perfect 10 across the board for these categories, especially due to stuff like the Wander hints being absolutely mangled in the English translations, thank you Craven Ubishit, and the fucking insane difficulty curve that I'll get to in a moment, for the most part, Zero does a great job at getting you settled into the TXR game loop as established in the last two, and making that as fun as can be with physics that are the perfect combo of floaty and snappy for this map, and an upgrading customization system that predates the original Undergrounds by a whole 2 years, and has some features that weren't even in that game. Now, that difficulty curve I mentioned isn't an insignificant factor like it is in a lot of racing games. When people talk about games like Forza Horizon 5 having basically no difficulty curve, or GT3 having one that's far too difficult in the early game, they've probably never played Zero. Most people, when they think of a reasonable difficulty curve, might picture something like this, basically just a straight, increasing line between player skill and what the game asks of the player in challenge. Now, this works if your game features extremely simple gameplay, and I mean like Tetris simple, but with the complexities of modern games, a straight line doesn't do a good progression justice. A good progression now would look something like this, with peaks, valleys, and plateaus reflective of what actually happens in a modern game. This could be boss fights, grind sessions, gear acquisitions, story beats, long walking areas, or places where the game just hands you everything. But in any case, this is what a lot of great progression difficulty curves look like. Now, that's not to say that all great curves fit this mold. In fact, some of my favorites start a lot higher or lower depending on what they're going for, but this is a good baseline for conceptualizing what I'm going to say next, which is that TXR0's difficulty curve looks like this. Now, you might notice how this looks very different from a lot of the examples I showed before. And that's because I have kind of always hated this game's difficulty as much as I love the game itself. Now, you can call me a wuss or type skill issue or whatever, but look, Midnight Club 3, Pro Street, and Dirt Rally 2 are some of my favorite racing games of all time. I fucks with difficulty. But, and this is a big ass but, this is a game that has one of the worst opening hours, difficulty-wise, I've seen in a racing game. Why? Because it literally all comes down to car choice. When you first start up the game, there's well over a dozen cars that you can afford straight off the bat, and each car is broken down into 3 classes. If I'm being honest with you, most of the C-class cars, i.e. the class with the most affordable cars, are basically unusable in the early game. Like, let's take an example. The Toyota Corolla AE86. Oh wait, they still don't have car names yet? This is the last game to not have them, so this is the best a Type AE86 T3 is ever gonna look, I guess. But take the 86 as an example. Classic, staple JDM starter that any basement weeb or aspiring drifter should recognize. This car is absolutely hellish to use in the opening hours because of how underpowered it is. Which is funny, because the literal first crew of rivals you're going to encounter in the game is made up of only 86s, and will absolutely destroy you in them. That's not even to mention how barely 2 crews later you're already racing against a crew of guys with over 300 horsepower. Like, how are you going to combat that in an 86 barely pushing 200? Yeah, you can argue weight, but in the early game, acceleration and handling only matter on like 2 main bits of the highway. The rest can basically be chalked up to speed, and so either you have to get extremely lucky or get bent. The best thing you can hope for is an AI being so dumb that it smacks headfirst into a traffic car and gives you enough of a gap to win by default. And you're so slow at this point, even that isn't a guaranteed win. Now as the progression goes on and you get cars that are more on par with what your opponents bring in, and while there is some degree of meta and driving style preference that can play into how good late game cars are, for the most part, it's fairly smooth from there on. But damn, those first 2 to 4 hours can be painful the first time you go through them. That opening is basically the litmus test for the rest of the game. If you can survive that in anything but like the one A class the game lets you afford, and you're still having some amount of fun, you're really gonna like the rest of the game. And I'm glad I do. Because with how satisfying the refined gameplay loop can be, this is a perfect game both for an active and what I call a more, let's say, passive playthrough. Because I'm built in a particularly stupid way, I've gotten in the groove where I can enjoy a game on its own merits, taking in all the visuals, sounds, and little extra bits of dialogue that make a game interesting, but if it's a game I've already played a lot of, or that I know has a lot of repetition in its gameplay, both of which describe my favorite racing games, then my non-stimulated ADHD ass is more often than not gonna put on some show or movie or especially video to have something going on in the background while I play a game that, theoretically, should require my full attention. Like as an example, there was one night in late 2024 where I was playing Dirt Rally 2.0 on my wheel setup while having the Straight Outta Compton biopic playing on the second monitor, and that combination of physical and mental stimulation, for whatever reason, gave me one of the best sleeps I had had in months after I had finished. I have no idea why I did that, or why I'm remembering this event so vividly, but this is just what I mean when I say I'm built a little stupid. And I bring all that bullshit up because TXR, and especially TXR 0, is probably one of my favorite games to play, and also just turn my brain off at the same time. Which sounds like a negative, but like, if you're a fan of these games, and you have a similar worm of mind that I do, then you should get the feel I'm talking about. It's not that the game is boring or unengaging, it's just that I've played it so much that it effectively matches my brain's background frequency, so I'll often have to do something else to reach peak stimulation. Am I autistic? I would not remotely recommend doing that as a new player. I still go through every new game I play focusing on just the game, because I still do want that experience, all the unique stuff like sound design and music, which this game also does really well, but after I've experienced it enough times, I usually end up muting it while I have some other slop on in the background. Also, for any new players looking to get into the series, as much as I like this game, I wouldn't recommend it for first-time players of the series. 1, because of the difficulty curve I mentioned. 2, because there's 2 other games later that I think give a more fleshed out and beginner-friendly experience. And 3, because this game was never released on PC, which means the best ways to play it now would either be to get a used game or to emulate it. It would be pretty cool though if this game ever got a PC release. Shutokō Battle Online is an online-only, Japan-only, PC-only racing game released by Genki 2 years after Zero, and is an MMO racing game built mostly on TXR 0. Now, as you can imagine, for an online-only multiplayer game from a small studio released 2 decades ago, the game has long since shut down. But there has been this revival project going for almost a decade now by Tofu Man, which means the game is now playable. I say playable because even keeping in mind the MMO branding and limited scope, this game is and kinda always was pretty barren. The only real interesting facts about this game is that it's one of the only entries that supports online play as of the writing of this video. It has this unique thing where instead of having a dedicated garage mode where you pick your cars, buy new ones, and upgrade them, you now get to pull into parking areas that lead you to other versions of the C1 loop map, which themselves have parking areas focused on a type of normal menu activity. So, the upgrade loop has parking areas broken up by upgrade type, the car dealership loop is broken down by manufacturer, etc. Speaking of manufacturers, you notice anything? This is somehow the first game in the series to feature real licensed cars. which I can tell you was a very last minute thing because some of the car models that they just ported straight from Zero still have the fake branding on them despite having a very real car name when you go to buy it. Like, bro, how did you screw that up? I see why no one noticed though. Barely anyone knows this game exists, because to be fair, outside of the fact that being able to race your friends in what is effectively Zero with only keyboard controls is a cool idea, there's really nothing too interesting about this game. Would be interesting to see what changes they bring in the next one though.
TXRD.
TXRD. Now this is a very different beast compared to the last few games. As you might immediately notice by the lack of highways, to steal another comparison often used when talking about these games, in concept, the Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift offshoot is to the mainline series what Initial D is to Wangan Midnight. Not to say Initial D is a spin-off of Wangan, but that they share some similar elements with one immediately apparent difference, that being their setting. The Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift series, as the name implies, is focused more on drifting and toge racing closer to what appeared in some of the earlier entries. So instead of racing around major city expressways, you now get to race up and down the mountain passes in places like Hakone, Haruna, and the Iraha slopes in Nikko, with later entries expanding the track list across Japan. This means that the Drift series, originally called the Kaido Battle series or Kaido Racer in Europe, takes a very different approach to racing than the base series, while still retaining some common elements, like the customization, the style, the sound design, and the iconic SP battle system, which I'd argue fits the mountain pass setting even better than it did on the expressways. However, because this was effectively their first attempt at this sort of thing, they had some serious kinks to work out, and that became very apparent as I played through this game. While I didn't technically grow up with this game, I did pick it up at a used media and game store when I was around 10 years old, so I do have some nostalgia for it, which is probably going to do this game a favor, as without that nostalgia, I would not have a lot of favorable stuff to say about this game. To start, I feel like I need to talk about how the cars feel in races. In my initial playthroughs, I thought the physics in this game were straight up awful. And while I do have my quarrels with them, mainly the lack of longitudinal grip versus the amount of lateral grip you have, a lot of my problems really come from the camera. See, look here, in most racing games, the default camera used is the chase cam, sometimes with a variation or two, with a separate forward camera usually situated on the bumper, although hood and more recently the most immersive cockpit cameras have seen more use. In most arcade racers, the chase camera pivots off the center line of the car, or at least a point perpendicular to the centerline midpoint like in Underground 2. In most simulators, it's common for the camera to remain in a fixed position behind the car in order to help better judge corner entries and braking distances. Both of these have their strengths and weaknesses, and both are better for certain applications. A good example of this is the Gran Turismo series, because the first 3 games go with the former chase camera system, while every game since 4 has gone with the latter. There's still debate as to whether or not the switch was the right move, but I'd say in general, arcade racers benefit more from the looser approach, as it can accentuate the sense of speed while cornering. TXRD, on the other hand, decided both of those systems were dumb and stupid, and so chose to put its pivot here, at the back of the car. This means you get a perfect view of your car's 7-pixel badge no matter how far you turn, but actually judging the corners becomes a massive pain if you've played literally any other racing game. Why they did this, I have no idea, because both games before and after this would have the more conventional chase camera, and I see zero reason to do this, but they did it anyway. But I gotta talk about some positives before I come off like I hate this game. I really do like this game's campaign and progression. In concept, I thought it would be difficult to put the main series loop of racing until your car's tires and engine start to slow too much, then going back to the garage to upgrade, into a game that doesn't have an open world and also now features multiple tracks plus a distinct night and day mode, but I think they pretty much nailed it. The basic loop of all three, I'll explain later, Tokyo Xtreme Racer drift games is that you start out with the daytime, where you can race for cash and sponsors, as well as the occasional opponent at the parking areas. Then you use the money you earn to upgrade or buy new cars. Then you switch to the night mode, where these standard drift and time trials disappear, and now the parking areas become a lot more populated. Here, you progress by beating rivals and gaining reputation, which earns you an initially small amount of credits, but will lead to racing against boss cars, labeled slashers, which are effectively the leaders of each area, and beating one will unlock more cars, upgrades, and usually a new mountain pass or two. There are also a few other rival types, and each entry adds a few more, but in general they just add a little more depth and complexity to the progression. Now you might think you would just race against people and eventually you'd build up enough rep to be noticed by the big dogs, but no. Your rep is actually a nearly useless statistic in most of the progression, as when you actually do get the slashers' attention, you won't be told that they're ready to race you. You'll be told that they're challenging you, and you have to respond, not on the track, but on the message board. That's right. The Drift sub-series all feature a full forum where you get to see rivals talking, people complaining or raging after you beat them, and it's where you get challenges from both bosses and specialty opponents, which offer high wagers or special rewards. It might sound a little obtuse in concept, but it's a lot of fun if you're someone who enjoys flavor text, and if not, it's just a neat way to add a bit of world building in a way not often looked at in other street racers. The best modern examples I can think of would be how the cell phones are used in games like Midnight Club LA or more recently Night Runners, where drivers and rivals conversate with the player to initiate challenges or set objectives, really making the world around the game feel more real. And in TXRD's case, choosing to accept the challenge during the day means that the rival will show up that following night, meaning you can accept a challenge, then spend the day preparing yourself for the upcoming race, which I think is a good way to pace it out, especially since you can just play through several days without accepting the challenge to have even more preparation. That's another good thing about the segmented day-night progression, it's basically impossible to soft-lock yourself. Even if you pick one of the worst cars in the game, there's always some day event easy enough for you to do, and because you can just skip straight from day to night and back, you can do that event as many times as you need to get some upgrades or a better car. So even if it might require some light grinding, you can just about always dig yourself out of a car performance hole, which I think is good for players with less confidence in their skills. There's also a bunch of little additions, like the first game to feature visual upgrades from real brands, races having more than one racer, and also having a strong visual and sonic style like the rest of the series so far. Although the negatives with the camera, the physics and therefore general gameplay, and the AI that I should probably mention have zero spatial awareness and will oftentimes take the dumbest lines yet still be faster than you because of their immense grip, mean that it's hard to recommend this game to a newcomer for the franchise. Thankfully though, they did give the Tokyo racing concept a couple more attempts in the following years. While Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift did release before this next game in its native home, we actually didn't get that release for a whole 3 years, meaning the next title we saw from the franchise was this, Tokyo Xtreme Racer 3. That name might cause some confusion because wasn't the last one called Zero, but in Japan, this was actually called Shutokō Battle 01, meaning it takes place after Zero. There's a bunch of lore stuff about the games and how they're all connected, which is really cool to learn about if you're into it. Shit, I'm into it. But I couldn't think of a faster way to tank this video's already bad pacing than to give the full TXR lore. I'll leave that to someone with more experience with this series, like Thunder THR or Kingdom 12 if he ever gets back to making racing game videos, or maybe just myself for another time. For now, all you really need to know is that they are connected, hence why you'll see a lot of the same crews and bosses appear throughout a bunch of the games, especially the ones not set in the mountains. Funnily enough, this game features new cutscenes and a little bit of story exposition and almost poetic wording if it didn't also come across like a mistranslation, so I guess there is some immediate story to pay attention to if you're into that. Regardless, it's not necessary to enjoy the gameplay, which, in my opinion, is basically just TXR 0, but better in almost every way. Like, basically every area I could think of to improve on 0, this game does. Oh, you thought having the massive southern part of the Shoto Expressway down into Yokohama was impressive? How about that, and a full Osaka and Nagoya map, with their own unique rivals and bosses? Oh, you thought having licensed cars in the online-only game was cool? How about a game with arguably the most diverse car list in the series? Yeah, it's not the biggest, but what other games in the series have the Isuzu V-Across, the FBRX7, 2 Gambalas, 3 Lotuses, and the only TXR since getting licensed vehicles to feature American models, including the Viper, Corvette, and Ford GT. Yes, you can argue the Fords that would show up in the Drift games, but those are all Ford Europe models. These are the cars that are undeniably American. There is no Honda in this game though, which is a massive loss. This game also features a style which is understated, but really shines as you play through the game. One of my favorite examples of this is during certain key boss races, they change up the music to a more intense, almost anime boss theme-like score, and when you get up to speed, they add streaking light effects to the edge of the screen to emphasize the intensity of the races. Some of the even faster bosses literally start aura farming right in front of you like they're fucking Gojo. The rest of the game's style gives off a darker, more melancholic tone than 0, despite 0 being literally darker brightness-wise, but I think it fits with the rest of 3's story and structure. 3 is also, from my experience, one of the longer games in the franchise, and I'm just talking about base game content. All of these games take forever to 100% because of the extra 100 or so opponents you get from the Wanderers alone. They also improved the customization by adding the game's first proper livery editor, which, in classic 2003 fashion, is basically just PS2 MS Paint, and I love that. And also by adding in a bunch of new body parts to most of the models, including the ability to use different materials like carbon fiber on them to further reduce weight. Honestly, this game has a lot of really great stuff in it, and because it also fixes my initial insane difficulty problem from TXR 0, this is one of the 2 entries I would recommend to a first-time player. If you try this and enjoy it, then I'd say go back to stuff like the original and 0. Or later entries if you want to see what they add in. However, just because it's my pick for the best place to start, does not mean I think this game is perfect. In fact, on my personal ranking, I actually put it lower than 0. It's nothing too major, but it's stuff like the physics being a bit sloppier and less fun to use at speed than 0's, the traffic being a lot less dense, which takes away from the more alive feeling 0 had, not helped by 3's kind of dimmer aesthetic. The progression, while easier to get through than 0's, also suffers from a few major slow spots where it feels like not a lot's happening, and also because of the rushing they had to do to effectively get out 3 games in 1 year, there's some major polish issues at a few points. Like, if you try to emulate the US version of the game, there's a high chance you'll get a crash around the middle point, which you need a patch to pass. And if you can get past that, you still can't beat the game because there's a money cap glitch on the US version that means you can't make enough to get one of the final boss requirements and actually finish the game, requiring yet another patch. Or Game Shark if you're playing on original hardware, because this actually affects that too, kinda like Gran Turismo's early 98.2% completion bug. So this game definitely ain't perfect, but I think the same can be said about this franchise as a whole. It's not a flawless piece, but some of those flaws are expected from a small studio already making a game as good as this. And in my opinion, this isn't even their best work yet. And back to the mountains we go, although this time without a US release. Yeah, that's why I wasn't very specific about the 3 Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift games, because in reality there aren't 3 Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift games. There's Kaido Battle 1, Kaido Battle 2 Chain Reaction, and Kaido Battle Toge no Densetsu. The first and third entries of which got US releases under Crave Entertainment, and the second and third entries got European releases under Konami. So yes, there is an English version of the second TXR-related Toge Racer. No, it never came to America. In my opinion, they were really holding out on us with that, because I think if I had this game as a kid, this might have been my favorite game in the whole series. Like the difference between TXR 1 and 0, Kaido Racer, which this game went by in PAL regions, was a massive leap compared to TXR Drift 1. The most immediate difference you can see is that they fixed the awful chase camera from 1, but they also made some equally large improvements to the physics. And to be honest, even if this might be a hot take, I don't know, but I think this handily has the best physics of all three Toge-focused Genki racers. There's something about how the cars in this game feel that just clicks with me so well. It's the weight and its momentum, the different feeling I get driving cars with different proportions and weight distributions. It's so detailed, I'd almost be willing to call it sim-like, but then it's extremely forgiving in the spots most sims would punish you, and yet still very punishing should you push it too much. This shouldn't work as well as it does, but regardless of what I think, that's just what I feel. You can see it in my gameplay just how much smoother I drive compared to this slippery and awkward Drift 1, and, spoilers, the laggy, heavy, and kinda overbearing Drift 2. There's not many other ways I can say how good I think this game's physics are, but like, it just works for me. It has this sort of pointed, very acceleration-focused handling that makes the cars not just fun to drive like I normally would, but even better in bumper cam. Yes, I know I ranted earlier about how I'm not usually someone who uses bumper cams in racing games, but that's because they usually don't excite me in the same way a well-crafted chase cam does. However, in this game, you can tell just how much care was put into the feeling of the bumper cam as much as the chase cam. And it feels exciting. You might notice I'm making a bunch of little micro adjustments here while driving at speed, and while some people might see stuff like that and call the game overly twitchy, I don't feel that. I feel like I'm on a rally stage and I'm on the edge of control with every passing moment, or more relevantly to this game, like I'm in a Japanese arcade and I'm playing one of the Initial D arcade stages, which also uses this kind of camera setup. And the gameplay isn't the only thing that got better, how the game progresses improved too. Thinking back to when I talked about difficulty curves with Zero, this game features a little more difficulty than I'd expect a new player to handle, especially in those early hours. But once I got even the slightest taste of performance in this game, I had so much fun with it. It's structured in a very similar way to the first. Daytime you earn money and upgrades, night you earn rep and progress the campaign. You do actually receive wagers from basically all the opponents now, which is a nice touch. And also, sound source received? What? Most of the progression is like the first, but just smoother, if that makes any sense. They also introduced the goofiest rival type in the series called Lovers, which originally had me thinking we were going to be on some Street Racing Syndicate R-Racing Revolution time. If you know, you know. But nah, this is just another rival type that's a little more difficult. There's more general content in this game than the last. There's more cars, tracks, more variety in said cars, a few more customization options here and there, just general improvements. And the vibe of this game is a little better too. I'm not going to call this an amazing aesthetic, but this just gives me more of those early 2000s Windows XP kind of vibes that I always enjoy to see. Oh, also, this is the best game in the series. Why? Because it has the best feature in the series, which is this. This little menu called Sound Editor. The first two options here are interesting, but not all that special. It's a music swapper, so you can change what songs play in what conditions, which is cool. And this is a catalog of all the songs in the actual OST. But the next two are where it gets interesting. You have Sound Source Config, which is a list of all the sounds and samples used in both the OST and in some of the previous OSTs. You unlock them by progressing through the game, which is what that sound source received from earlier was. But then, what can you do with just a bunch of samples? Exactly what you think. You go down to BGM Creator and literally create your own background music that you can swap out in place of the actual in-game tracks. Like what games that aren't at all focused around music do you know that let you do this? And also, it's not just that these samples you can use are from the in-game music. The in-game music is literally made in the sampler. You spend the whole game, except for the banging intro, listening to music that you yourself could have entirely created in-game. Sure, it's not a full digital audio workstation, but as a neat little sampler with decent tools and as effectively a free sample library that you could just have, I fuck with this heavy. And really, that's just how the whole game is. There's so much attention paid to small stuff like the sound editor, or how the rivals interact with each other and talk with the player in the newly separate BBS and mail system, which gives you not just little quips and complaints from recently beat drivers, but also tips on how and when to find rivals, general advice and good knowledge for progressing through the game, and even direct challenges from certain rivals and bosses. This is why, despite being far from the game I've played most in the series in general, this was the game I played most for this video. Because even though I already have a lot of experience with the series, this still feels fresh and fun. And if not for nostalgia, this would probably be my favorite game in the series. And this isn't even the only game I got to enjoy without any rose-tinted specs on. Of course, the game I'm talking about was a legendary release that Genki didn't actually make, and was released on April 20th, 2005. Nice. On one of the most powerful and legendary consoles of all time. And then the day after we got Street Supremacy. For some reason, and this might just be the different standards for the time showing through, but almost all the critic reviews, and even some individual reviewers from when this game came out, absolutely hated it. Even IGN, back before the everything is an 8 out of 10 IGN we know today, gave this a 2.5 out of 10. And not only did they drag the game, they were actually kind of funny. A lot of them seem to just dismiss the game outright, but even the ones that gave legitimate reasons don't make me think the game is a 4 out of 10 like they said it was. Like, one of the more common critiques was that the loading times were bad and the menus were hard to navigate. I'm not going to argue that this is the smoothest game to navigate, but using this game as a baseline, I swear half the PS1 catalog is just straight garbage off the bat. Another common issue I saw was about the slippery physics. I'm sorry, what? What do you mean ice physics? Does this look like ice physics to you? If anything, this looks kind of stiff and not as dynamic as something like TXR0. Am I missing something here? And another complaint they had was the lack of true free roam in this game. I'm not going to say that's not a legitimate complaint, especially since it was in the last 4 mainline entries, but also, is free roaming around a single expressway loop in Tokyo the reason you would buy this game? If anyone tells you there's no point in getting TXR because SRP exists, I'm going to assume that's their argument. Regardless, I had a pretty decent time with this game. I'm not going to call it an outright classic, and I would put it towards the bottom half of the series quality-wise, but for what is effectively a portable TXR, this was a PSP exclusive, I think this game is more than worth it. Let's start with the game's signature feature, the team battles. Instead of progressing through the campaign like you would in the other TXRs by beating rivals until you get to their team boss and then beating them to get more rivals, and also wanderers, in Street Supremacy, the beginning is basically the same, except for being able to choose your starting area and therefore what team you face first. So you race the team, and then once you've beaten enough of them, you challenge their boss. Now here's where things get good. When you beat their boss, you don't just defeat their team, you take over their team, making you their new leader. Now your goal becomes to beat drivers from other teams, recruit them, and then take other teams' territories in team battles, which is a 5v5 between you, 4 drivers you pick from your team, and the 5 best from the opposing team. Effectively, think of this as what could have been if Black Box actually had the time to flesh out the crew mechanics from Need for Speed Carbon. And similar to Carbon, these battles aren't a one-way street. You will be challenged by the other teams fairly often, and in my playthrough I even lost some territories in the early game because of how competitive the other teams can be. This is the kind of stuff I really like to see. because it takes the standard progression formula of most racing games, and to me, effectively gives it the feeling of steamrolling foreign enemies in a Paradox game. It's really fun to just wipe the floor with a whole territory of slow drivers, and it was just as fun to get challenged and lose, because it felt unique every time. I definitely had my issues with this game, menuing and load times notwithstanding, but the general gameplay loop and progression, combined with the series staple vibes, rivals, customization, and classic car list, made this a fun little experience. It wasn't super in-depth, but it's a PSP game, so I wasn't expecting that. Even though it's nowhere near this level of quality, I'm going to paraphrase what I said about Pro Street in my Need for Speed review, which is that if you missed out on this game back in the day because you saw a bunch of old reviewers talking down about it, give this game a quick try, especially if you're a fan of the other games and in need of more TXR, because as I've shown before, you could certainly do a lot worse. Now this next game is that spin-off from the series I mentioned earlier, because in no territory is this game called Shutokō Battle, Kaido Battle, or any kind of Tokyo Xtreme Racer. In fact, I could see the argument that this isn't even a part of the series, but the similar gameplay, return of a handful of series rivals, and the general TXR vibe mean I can count it for this video. The other notable thing about Racing Battle C1 Grand Prix is that it was never released anywhere outside of Japan. So how am I playing an English version of it now? Well, I'm technically not. This is the Japanese game, just with a fan translation. The patch is from Igor's777 and was started just last year, and was effectively finished a few months before this video came out. If not for him and those who helped him with the tools used in the translation, I basically wouldn't be able to review this game, so big ups them. From my perspective, this is basically what happens if you take some of the best parts of Tokyo Xtreme Racer 3, Drift 1, Gran Turismo 4, Project Gotham Racing 1 and 4, and put them together, with a little bit of Pro Street. I would call this a track racer because the menuing and progression makes it function like one, but that's not entirely accurate. The gameplay of this basically centers around you selecting one of several different events consisting of either several opponent races, either an SP, time attack, or drifting, or a single event against a boss or in a special sponsored event. I remember reading somewhere that the game's name is actually a reference to the event types, with C1 Grand Prix being a combination of D1 Grand Prix, one of the oldest drifting championships in the world, and the C1 Loop, the road most featured in the TXR games. It initially took me some time to click with this game, as the early hours, I'm not gonna say feel slow, but more just kind of uneventful, at least compared to the other mainline games. But as I played through it more, the game felt like it opened up a lot and became a far more enjoyable experience. The PGR feel I mentioned comes from the NP points, or notorious points, which you get from stuff like clean driving, drifting, and winning races, and helps in stuff like part unlocks and special event conditions. Like for certain races, you have to have a high enough NP level. You see why I think that's a bit like PGR's kudos? The handling in this game is also a little closer to PGR or Gran Turismo than most of the other main TXRs, as well as a little bit of the stiffness from Street Supremacy, but it's still firmly on the arcade side of Simcade. Also, if you're wondering what this kind of weird speed effect is, I guess it's their way of adding more to the sense of speed in a game that, in general, feels slower than its predecessors. You might also think it's an emulation or resolution bug, but no, it looks like that on both original resolution and hardware, although it is more noticeable with what it's doing on high-res emulation, just kind of wiggling the edges of the screen with increasing intensity to how fast you're going. I'm not the biggest fan of it, and it did take a few races to get used to, but it's not a deal breaker by any means. Speaking of visuals, this game features a much cleaner, almost Forza Motorsport 3-like aesthetic throughout, and the music? Genuinely one of my favorite OSTs in the series. It skews a lot more techno and drum and bass than a lot of the others, so keep that in mind if you go to check it out, but if you like Midnight Club 2 or maybe some of the classic Need for Speed OSTs, you'll probably find something to like here. I didn't put a whole lot of time into this game for the recording, not just because it wasn't a mainline entry, but because of all the games I got to experience for the first time making this video. This is probably the one I'm most likely to revisit and play even more off camera. And that's basically the highest praise I can give a first time experience. Unlike the next game, which I probably have the most experience with. Genki, Japanese, meaning energy, vitality, or spirit. Any game made by a company calling itself Genki, I believe should try to have the spirit and enthusiasm associated with that kind of name. And if any game were to do it, I think it would be... Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift 2. TXRD2 is one of those games that I have a truly difficult time speaking about objectively, like a Need for Speed Pro Street or an Xbox 360 edition Minecraft. And like those two games in particular, if not for this game, there's a chance this channel might not exist. To take it back almost a decade now, I started this channel out with me recording my old CRT TV using an Acer tablet that was already old and cheap by 2016 standards. And I made a bunch of different series of me playing various games. Or, I say made, I mainly just started the series. Almost none of them made it to even an episode 5. But one of only a handful that did was this game, Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift 2. I made over 25 videos on this game, and even played far enough to reach one of the endings in that playthrough. They're not great videos, obviously. I was only 12 when I recorded most of these, and while unlisted, they can still be found on a public playlist on the channel, alongside a video from an old account that I forgot the name of, and also which is somewhat reminiscent of my current style of music syncing, and also this video, The Art of Toge. This video was something I had in mind months before it released, and while I didn't know how I was going to make it, I knew I wanted to make a video on Drift 2. I was still figuring out whether or not I wanted it to be more gameplay focused, more like a review, or even just a goofy showcase of my favorite parts, a la JonTron or Kadikarus. But it really turned into an amalgamation of all those ideas, combined with my major influences like Noodle and Emplemon. This video is rough. I even kinda knew that at the time, and I got a lot of things wrong. But for a kid's first proper attempt at a YouTube video, I think I did pretty good. And a lot of you seem to agree. My first well-made video getting 20,000 views in the first 2 weeks was what ultimately convinced me I had a knack for making YouTube videos, which is something I had always wanted to do, but figured I was never good enough to truly commit to it. But this video showed me otherwise. If you've been watching since that original video, thank you. I'm glad I could entertain and inform for as long as I have, and also, please tell me you've noticed the improvements or other ways I could improve, because I'm always looking to make my stuff better. Wait, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you because I think if it were any other game that didn't have the vibrant, captivating, and unique quality of Drift 2, I'm not sure I would have thought to make a video on it like I did. And even all these years later, it's still one of my favorite racing games, period. Now, the quickest way to bring myself back down to earth when talking about something I truly love is to explain why it sucks, actually. And as much as I hate to admit it, there's a fair amount of stuff to dislike this game for. One of the most obvious and immediate things is the physics. As much as I don't think about them as a deal breaker now, they took me effectively years before I got a decent grasp on them. And even now, I'm not particularly clean. It just kind of feels wobbly and uneasy and has weird aspects of both feeling weightless and way too heavy, which feels wrong to say, but if you've played the game, you probably understand what I mean. I also swear there's a certain level of input delay to the turning, but others have told me that's not the case, so maybe that's just me. Another aspect is this game's progression, and another related problem I'm just gonna label backseating. Backseating, or in this case, backseat gaming for those unfamiliar, is a term for the act of excessively commentating over the in-game decisions and actions of someone playing a video game, whilst not playing said game. This is most commonly used now in the context of stuff like live streaming, where the streamer, experiencing a game for the first time, isn't going to understand or even experience all the nuances and subtle details a veteran player is likely to catch or enjoy. So when the streamer inevitably misses something or is coming up on a really interesting section, the chatter is likely to spoil or ruin any possible discovery by giving the streamer the answer or by making the streamer's choices seem incorrect if they don't experience the whole game. This is bad in almost every game, but story-heavy games, RPGs, and any kind of game with hidden or off-the-beaten-path details are particularly affected. In my experience, Drift 2 is an extremely backseatable game, and I say this as a fan of the games from Toby Don't Call Me Radiation Fox. Games literally so backseatable that some players refuse to record or stream the games because of the backseating. Like as an example, I watched fellow Forza enjoyer and friend of the channel Hoki Hoshi start playing this game for the first time on stream. And although he was helped by already having experience with the series, and a few tips from Chad and researching beforehand, he had to play this game in a very particular way to not miss anything and to not be backseated. He had to check every car shop option, every upgrade part, every rival text, every sponsor test, every track spot, and even then, he's still inevitably going to miss something because of how many things there are to see in this game, combined with the fact that certain parts are just trial and error on when it happens, and you might only know if something happens if you meet all the specific requirements. Remember all the way back in the TXR2 section when I talked about Wanderers having oddly specific requirements? Well, the late game of Drift 2 is filled with rivals and bosses just like that. After you beat the two main bosses, in my opinion, you might as well just go ahead and open up the game FAQs page from there, because you just will not find some of these requirements. Driftwood, apply for race in new car shop, will appear on Wednesday when weather is sunny. Blackout, defeat rival number 323, apply for race in BBS, requires fans 1300/prizes 38. Godshift Bunta, defeat rival 319, 332, and 349. He will appear on the 4th week Sunday when the weather is stormy. Genuinely, how do you figure this out as a first-time player? And these are just a few examples. The late game has dozens of examples like that, and yes, that is only a fraction of the 357 rivals included in this game, including rival number 0, that is still enough to make 100%ing this game a particular pain in the ass. But if you're not playing this game to 100%, and you're not streaming it, and you're playing through it at your own pace, checking guides where necessary, and making your own choices, this is one of the most fun games you can play. Let me start with one of my favorite fun facts. You know how I mentioned Wangan Midnight and Initial D in the earlier sections? Well, turns out, Genki loves to make references to car-related media. The final boss of almost all the TXR games is a reference to Wangan Midnight. Zero actually featured a sticker and trailer for the first Fast and Furious movie, and also Genki almost made one of the many Fast and Furious licensed games, which is a story for another time. So it shouldn't be that surprising that TXRD2 is full of references to Initial D. Spoilers for a lot of this game and a little bit of Initial D. Right off the bat, you can literally name yourself after a character from Initial D and you'll get more starting credits the more important the character is, with Takumi, Takashi, and Takahashi almost doubling the amount of cash you start with. There's a bunch of rivals that reference drivers from Initial D, including Godshift Bunta that I mentioned earlier, and the slasher from Aki has an introduction video that's filled with references to Initial D locations and cars. As someone who's been a lifelong Initial D fan, and who was even more so when I first played this game, I always love to see this. And speaking of the introduction videos, I gotta talk about this game's vibe. The aesthetic and vibe of this game is something that I would love to see brought back. This game kinda does the same as another favorite of mine in Pro Street, where instead of driving your cars around in a stylized world and with custom lighting and effects that would add to the style, they instead take a more grounded approach of putting you in real places, then adding their own unique style to those real environments. This means you get to drift into the cherry blossoms of Hakone, or slide around the gravel of the Hokkaido rally stage. Oh yeah, this game has an actual rally stage. Actually, side tangent, this game has 19 different locations, the majority of which were laser scanned? I couldn't really find a source on that, but if true, that would put it on par with, or maybe even ahead of Gran Turismo on doing laser scanning this early. Editing Fast Miner here, this was actually true, as none of the sources I found gave any substantial evidence outside of a single image posted on the cutting room floor, but then I was watching Hoki Hoshi's stream and he pulled up a promotional video for the original Tokyo Xtreme Racer Drift, where lo and behold, they show how they did radar scanning not for TXR Drift 2, but actually for the original as well, making Drift 1 one of the earliest games I could find to use some form of laser scanning for its tracks. Most of the older sims only had GPS data and photos to go off of, and most of the games you might associate with early laser scanning like iRacing, R-Factor, Richard Burns, and Gran Turismo 4 all came out after Drift 1 did. So Drift 1 might genuinely be an important entry in the evolution of real tracks in racing games. Who knew? But regardless, all the tracks in this game look great in all different configurations and weather conditions, without really having to do too much extra. Sure, it's still aged, and games like Most Wanted and Gran Turismo 4 feature much higher fidelity graphics on the same hardware, but this game still has a unique visual style that helps it stand out. And visuals aren't the only place it stands out in. The audio is great here too, except for the cars. Yeah, basically none of the TXR or TXR related games from Genki have particularly good car sounds, so if that's something you're a stickler for, I'd temper your expectations. But the rest of the game's sound design and music fits the vibe perfectly. There's iconic stuff like the clicky menu sounds, the narrator yelling at the start of every drift zone in the drift events, and the unique combination of electronic, rock, and jazz really works for this game, including the intro song composed by Daiki Kasho. Yes, that Daiki Kasho, the same guy who appears all over the last 2 decades of Gran Turismo soundtracks. I even bookended this very video with the ending credits theme from this game, so stay tuned to hear the end of it. Damn man, I almost can't get into all the reasons I like this game, because I still want to get into the fleshed out category and championship system, the sponsors that you can sign on with and then apply their decals to your car to earn more money. There's the return of Gymkhana, which is also the fastest way I've found to make money alongside with the sponsors. There's the amazing car list with a bunch of classic JDM cars, both well known and not. There's the event types, some that are a more traditional toge spin on the mountain racing, and some that are literally the worst thing ever coded into a video game. And that's without even getting into how the rivals now feature silhouettes and flavor text, which give them all a little more personality and would be series staples from here on. There's literally so many reasons I like this game, a lot of them nerdier and more nostalgia tinged than I'd like to admit, but even with that in mind, I don't have any problem with saying this is my favorite game in the entire series, even if I objectively think earlier entries were better. It's not the prettiest or the most polished, and the driving will take some time getting used to if you don't click with it, but honestly, this is still a title I'd recommend checking out, because it has so much to offer if you're willing to dig under the surface. Oh, this looks a little bit different, and for good reason. This is the first TXR game made for a 7th gen console, in this case being the Xbox 360. You'd honestly expect it to be on the PS3 given the series' track record of being on PlayStation, but I think it mainly comes down to the PS3 not being out when Import Tuner Challenge released. This game is odd. Even after putting over a dozen hours into it, I'm not exactly sure how to feel about this game. On the one hand, this is a new TXR game, finally in HD and with a lot of the improvements from the Drift games and Street Supremacy brought over to a more conventional C1 experience. On the other hand, this is kinda just a new TXR game. There's surprisingly little new that I noticed with this game. Like, the only notable additions I saw that didn't just come from one of the last 3 games, or from the new graphics, courtesy of the 360's power, were, The addition of the Shibuya route or Route 3 and the Shinjuku route or Route 4, both of which are other parts of the Shoto Expressway that come off the C1 loop. They made it where you could now find the same opponents on the inner and outer routes. Gameplay wise, think of this as the counterclockwise and clockwise routes respectively. And also you can now choose between 3 times of day, which are night, midnight, and daybreak, each featuring their own sets of opponents. Yeah, that's kinda it. All the other improvements, the newer car list, the special part unlocks, the parking areas with unique rival interactions, the chain team battles, and a few more, basically all come from the last 3 games. And if we compare it to the last true C1 focused TXR experience, we even lost a lot of features. We lost the European and American cars. We lost Honda again, although that's not saying much as they only appeared legally in the then Drift/Kaido games due to internal reasons. We lost the difficulty in a lot of the game, as this is basically the easiest game in the whole series. So if, like me, the difficulty played a part in how much you enjoyed these games, you might not like it as much. Although inversely, that does mean if you found the earlier games too difficult, this might be a good place to start. And we also lost Osaka, Nagoya, and almost the entirety of the Bayshore line, one of the most iconic parts of the greater Shoto Expressway. This is not really just a next-gen TXR, it's also a simplified TXR, as the same thing also applies to the stiffer and less dynamic handling, and the more streamlined progression, although the parking areas do add some well-needed variation to that. I do think I'm also being a little harsh. I don't dislike the game. I mean, I had a pretty fun time playing through it, but it's pretty apparent that they were both running a little light on new ideas and time while making this game, which makes even more sense looking at their production schedule and realizing they released 3 games in 3 months in 2005. Yes, I know they were all in production for a while and not everyone who worked on one worked on all 3 of them, and then a year later had to learn a whole new set of hardware to make this game. Those are not the easiest conditions for any team to work with, and with that in mind, ITC is still a really good effort that is worth at least a quick go around, but I don't think it ranks very high in the overall series. Would be interesting to see what it would look like if they took the changes from this game and applied them to a newer TXR, and based on their history, a new game would probably be right around the corner. Right? "18 years. It was almost 18 years after Import Tuner's release that we heard anything about a new TXR game. But it's not like Genki went completely under during that time. They were still making games, just not as notable ones as they had in previous years. They worked on the Wangan Midnight game and Katamari Forever, both for the PS3. They technically kept the Shutokō Battle name alive, however only in Japan and only on mobile, which they had actually started all the way back in 2001 and had most recently done with Shutokō Battle Xtreme, which released in 2017 and whose servers didn't even make it to the end of the year. They also started a Steam page, but the only game on it for the first few months was a platform/endless runner game about a little devil running away from a town she just terrorized. Why do I feel like if this game had any attention there would be some absolutely diabolical— But then on August 22nd, 2024, we got TXR was back, bitches, and this time on PC. Fans, myself included, were immediately hyped about the return. There was some understandable skepticism on what the game would look like and if it would be any good, seeing as Genki hadn't made a racing game like this in almost 20 years. But as the release got closer and closer, the expectations started to grow. But our understanding of what was to come grew as well. as Genki started putting out updates on what the new game was going to feature. They even made a post on Twitter using their English account about fans reaching out on what content creators Genki should collaborate with, and, by the looks of it, who would be good to send early access copies to. To which every content creator just kinda said themselves, because why wouldn't you? I actually chose to not reply to this at the time. 1, because I don't use Twitter, and 2, because I considered my first public outing with the series so bad in retrospect that I figured I didn't want to get directly involved with TXR or its main community until after I had done it justice. Which is what you're watching now. And like the rest of you, I waited patiently for the day of TXR's true return, and when that day came, I downloaded the game trying to answer the question I had for some time, being, could they deliver on the hours and days of fun I had with the previous games? Could they innovate on what made the originals so great? Could they truly make another Tokyo Xtreme Racer? And they fucking nailed it. You know when a lot of old school gamers revisit an old franchise they think fell off, and their solution to fixing it is to just make it like the old ones, but somehow better? I kinda hate that argument because of how oversimplified it is, but to be completely honest, if any game was gonna be the definition example of that, Tokyo Xtreme Racer is it. This game still feels like a classic TXR, in just about every aspect you could think of. C1, check. Classic rivals new and old, check. A list of JDM icons, check. SP battles, check. Parking areas, check. Customization, traffic, intense races, fun driving, immaculate vibes, it's all there. Returning players will already know what to expect from a lot of this game, but they'll definitely appreciate stuff like the continued story, return of all the classic teams, a metric ton of fun dialogue with basically every character, the menus featuring both a few original tracks and a lot of great remixes from the older games, all modernized and given a sheen that I think fits this game perfectly. And new players aren't left out either, with the easier races and more straightforward progression, kinda similar to import tuners, they'll have an easier time getting into this game than a lot of its older counterparts, which is a large part of why I have this as the other game, alongside TXR3, that I would recommend most to a first-time player of the series. And the vibes in this game are absolutely perfect. I think they might have taken the fighting game comparisons to heart when making this game, because to me, the menus and visual design remind me a lot of the general Bandai Namco fighting game style, if you get what I'm trying to say. Although more accurately, it's probably something like the Japanese arcade style, if anything. Damn do I love this game, man. It's so good to finally see a racing game of this caliber and quality come out after what felt like years of disappointments from the same names that bodied TXR back in the day. But that's also kinda where my issues with this game start. You see, the game itself, while great, is entering into a very different landscape than it would have 18 years ago. Games have changed, and in turn, so have the gamers that play them. This means that the reception this game has got, while almost unanimously positive, has had its unintended side effects, mainly on its extremes. On one side, you have people who vehemently hate the game, almost always because it doesn't match up in some arbitrary aspect to another racing game that does something similar. Oh, the customization isn't as good as Underground. Why would I play a game that takes place on the Wangan when I have Shutokō Revival Project or Night Runners? Those three are all definitely trying to serve the same purpose. For some reason, a few of the negative reviews I saw came from Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown fans? I guess they were still so mad that their game wasn't good they tried to tear this game down too. And honestly, some of these are really dumb, but I'm not gonna strawman and say that this is everyone, because a lot of people did have genuine reasons for disliking the game, whether it be the physics, the repetitive gameplay, the still pretty poor engine sounds, although to me that's not that big a deal, the fact that for the first 2 weeks no one in Canada could play the game because of a licensing issue, Whatever the case may be, just know that graphics, it not being a sim apparently, and whatever this is, are not actual reasons. Conversely, you also had a group of toxic superfans who shut down any criticism of the game without hesitation, and would rant about people not playing the game right, and thought yelling at VTubers was the best solution. Would you be surprised if I told you these same people were also a lot of the ones who got so pissed over a 16-year-old covering a game they liked poorly, that they would comment about it 2 years later under completely unrelated videos just to start an argument? Now again, there's no reason to strawman here. That was a fraction of the player base that enjoys this game. And really, having talked with some of the more active community members and modders, the community that's come up around TXR25 seems like a much better place than the one that had a War Thunder style military document leak. Yes, that actually happened. And since I'm always down for civil discussion, as long as it stays civil, I think I'll be trying to get more involved in the TXR community. And I think you should too, because with the new game lacking multiplayer, and it doesn't really look like it's ever going to be added in, TXR Discord servers and other groups are the best way to connect with other people who like these games. Hell, this video is a good place too, because I'm interested in seeing what y'all think of the series either here in the comments or in my Discord with the rest of my community. I always love to see healthy discussion, as well as people just sharing their experiences. And I think a game like TXR needs to be shared with more people, because we don't get many great racing games like this often, so we should celebrate them while they're here. I'm sorry this video took so long. I got hit with a lot of outside factors and ADHD brain rot all at the same time, but I think I'm past it now. I also want to give thanks to my patrons and YouTube members. You guys help support the channel even when I'm not uploading, and I really do appreciate that. Especially Zelepner, Gasser Alum, Metasick, and 2ouncezik on YouTube, and Lino, Kevin Krisham, Solid Chris, Military Snake, Devil Bullet, Montego, Ibi, and Adriatic Atrocities on Patreon. Thank you, and enjoy the music list.